If you had a perfectly working 7-year-old PC that Microsoft no longer officially supported for Windows 11, what would you do? Would you replace it or keep using it with Linux? I'd genuinely like to hear what you think and why, because that simple decision says a lot about how we see the future of our computers. If Linux can keep an old Windows PC alive, why would anyone replace a perfectly working computer just because Microsoft says it's too old? Think about that for a moment. Imagine you have a 6 or 7-year-old computer. It still starts normally, the processor still works, the storage is fine, you have enough RAM, and you can still browse the internet, watch videos, study, work, use everyday applications, and maybe even play games. There is nothing physically wrong with the machine. But Microsoft says your hardware is not officially supported by Windows 11. So what are you supposed to do? Spend hundreds of dollars on a new computer, or install a different operating system and continue using the machine you already own? That simple question is becoming one of the most interesting debates in personal computing in 2026. Microsoft ended standard Windows 10 support on October 14, 2025, and Windows 11 has stricter hardware requirements, including TPM 2.0 and other security and compatibility requirements. That does not mean every Windows 10 computer suddenly became useless. The hardware did not stop working on that day. The processor did not become slower. The SSD did not suddenly fail. The computer itself was still capable of doing many of the same things it did the day before. What changed was Microsoft's support for that operating system. And this is exactly where Linux gives PC owners another option. Instead of throwing away a perfectly usable computer, you can install a Linux distribution that matches the hardware. Linux Mint, Zorin OS, Fedora, Ubuntu, Debian, and many other distributions can give an older computer a completely new life. You can choose a lighter desktop if the hardware is old, or use a modern desktop if the machine is powerful enough. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether Microsoft considers your PC supported. The question becomes what your computer is actually capable of doing, and that is a very different way of looking at hardware. This matters for another reason as well. When people replace working computers simply because a new operating system requires newer hardware, perfectly usable machines eventually become electronic waste. Of course, sometimes buying a new computer is the right decision. New hardware can be faster, more efficient, and more secure, but not every old computer needs to be thrown away. Linux gives users another choice. Keep the hardware and change the software. That may sound like a small thing, but for someone who cannot afford a new PC or simply does not want to waste a working machine, it can make a huge difference. And this is where Linux starts doing something Windows 11 has a much harder time doing. Linux separates the operating system from the idea that you must constantly replace the hardware underneath it. Microsoft has to protect a huge ecosystem of processors, drivers, applications, businesses, and decades of compatibility. Linux is much more flexible because different distributions can make different decisions about hardware support and system design. Microsoft has to think about hundreds of millions of users who expect Windows to continue behaving like Windows. Linux can let different projects experiment with different ideas. Now, the story gets even more interesting when we talk about gaming. For years, if you told a serious PC gamer to switch to Linux, the first response would probably have been, "But what about my games?" And that was a completely fair question. Windows had the biggest game library, the strongest driver support, DirectX, anti-cheat compatibility, and almost every major game developer building around it. Linux gaming existed, but it was not something most ordinary gamers wanted to deal with. Valve changed that conversation with Proton. Proton is a compatibility technology that allows many Windows games to run on Linux through Steam. Instead of waiting for every developer to create a separate Linux version of every game, Proton allows many Windows games to work through a compatibility layer. For the user, the important part is much simpler than the technology behind it. You can open Steam, install a supported game, press play, and in many cases, the game simply runs. That does not mean Linux has defeated Windows in gaming. It absolutely has not. Valve's July 2026 Steam survey shows Windows at 93.67% and Linux at 401% of participating systems. Windows is still overwhelmingly dominant, but that 4% Linux share is important because Steam is an enormous gaming platform and millions of gaming systems running Linux is no longer something the industry can simply ignore. The bigger story is not just the percentage. The bigger story is what companies are now doing with Linux gaming. SteamOS, the Linux-based operating system used by Valve's Steam Deck, helped prove that Linux could disappear into a gaming experience. A person can buy a Steam Deck because they want to play games. They do not have to understand Linux, learn terminal commands, or care about the operating system underneath. They simply turn on the device, open their library, and play. That is a very important change. Linux does not necessarily have to convince millions of Windows users to become Linux experts. It just needs to become good enough that people can use a Linux-powered product without thinking about Linux at all. When the operating system becomes invisible and the product simply works, the argument becomes completely different. And now major hardware companies are paying attention. Lenovo has been working with SteamOS for the Legion Go 2, and Lenovo's own gaming community stated in March 2026 that the official SteamOS version for the Legion Go 2 would be shipping later in the year. That is important because this is not simply an enthusiast downloading Linux and installing it on unsupported hardware. It shows that a major PC manufacturer sees a Linux-based gaming operating system as something worth supporting on commercial gaming hardware. Think about how different that is from the traditional PC market. For decades, you bought a gaming PC or gaming laptop, and Windows was simply assumed to be the operating system. Now, companies can build gaming hardware around a different operating system and still provide a serious gaming experience. That does not mean Windows is disappearing from gaming. It means Windows is no longer the only possible foundation for every gaming device. But there is an important problem Linux still has to solve, and this is where we need to be honest. Anti-cheat remains one of the biggest weaknesses for Linux gaming. Some anti-cheat systems work with Proton, while others do not. Some developers have enabled Linux compatibility, while others have not. Games that depend heavily on kernel-level anti-cheat can be particularly difficult because their security systems are designed around Windows. If your favorite competitive game refuses to work on Linux, that alone may be enough reason for you to stay with Windows. That is not a failure of the user. It is simply one of the areas where Windows still has a major advantage. So Linux gaming is not about saying that every Windows game now works perfectly. It is about the fact that the old statement, Linux is useless for gaming, is no longer true. There are now enough games, enough hardware, enough Proton support, and enough interest from companies that Linux gaming has become a real part of the PC gaming market. And that is a huge change compared with where Linux was years ago. The next difference is less exciting to talk about, but it may actually matter more in the long run. Linux gives users much more freedom to decide how their operating system should work. Windows is one operating system developed and controlled by Microsoft. Linux is an entire ecosystem. There are different distributions, different desktop environments, different update models, different security approaches, and different ways of building the system. That means you can choose an operating system around your needs instead of changing your needs around one operating system. If you want something simple, you can choose something simple. If you want an operating system for gaming, you can choose one designed around gaming. If you have old hardware, you can choose something lightweight. If you want a development workstation, there are distributions designed for that too. And if you want maximum control, Linux gives you the ability to change parts of the system that Windows normally keeps much more tightly controlled. This flexibility is also why Linux has become a major testing ground for newer operating system ideas. One example is immutable or image-based Linux systems. Instead of treating the core operating system as a collection of files that can constantly be changed, these systems can keep the base system more controlled and make updates more predictable. Some can also make it easier to roll back to an earlier working version if an update causes a problem. Windows is also moving towards stronger isolation and security, so this is not a case of Linux having invented the entire idea while Microsoft has no answer. The difference is that Linux can experiment through many different projects at the same time. One distribution can try a new approach while another keeps the traditional model. If an idea works, it can spread through the ecosystem. Microsoft has to be much more careful because Windows is responsible for an enormous amount of existing software and hardware. That compatibility is one of Windows' biggest strengths, but it can also become a limitation. Microsoft has spent decades promising that old applications and hardware will continue to work. Businesses depend on that promise. Developers depend on it. Users depend on it. Microsoft cannot simply throw away decades of compatibility and redesign Windows from the ground up every few years. Linux has much more freedom to experiment because it is not tied to one single compatibility promise across the entire industry. And then there's another Windows 11 feature that has created a completely different debate: recall. Microsoft designed recall to help users find things they have previously seen on their PC by using snapshots of activity. Microsoft currently says recall is opt-in, and if a user does not choose to save snapshots, they remain off by default. Microsoft also says the snapshots are stored locally rather than simply being sent to Microsoft. So we should not make the false claim that Microsoft is secretly uploading every screenshot of your computer to the cloud. That is not what Microsoft's current documentation says. But there is still a legitimate question here. Do you actually want your computer creating a searchable history of your activity? Think about the amount of information that passes through a computer every day. Websites, documents, searches, applications, messages, and private information. Some people may find recall incredibly useful. Other people may decide that they never want such a feature on their computer. And this is another place where Linux's philosophy is different. There's no single company deciding that every Linux desktop should have one universal AI memory system. If you want AI features, you can install them. If you don't want them, you can choose a system without them. If you want a very simple desktop, you can have one. If you want an advanced AI workstation, you can build that too. Linux gives you a level of choice that is difficult to get from one centrally controlled operating system. And this brings us to the bigger picture. Linux is no longer just an alternative operating system sitting on the side of the PC market. Linux is already a major part of servers, cloud computing, supercomputers, embedded systems, and many other types of technology. The desktop has historically been Linux's weak point, but that is changing. The numbers are worth watching, although we need to understand exactly what they measure. StatCounter's desktop data shows Linux at a much higher share in the United States than the old 5% figure that became popular in 2025. At the same time, Steam's July 2026 survey puts Linux gaming at 4.01%. These numbers should not be mixed together because they measure different things, but together they show that Linux is no longer invisible. And this is why 2026 is such an interesting year for Linux. Linux doesn't need to become the world's #1 desktop operating system to have an impact. It simply needs to become good enough that users can say, I don't need Windows for this. Someone with an old laptop might say it. A gamer using a handheld might say it. A developer might say it. A privacy-focused user might say it. Someone who does not want to replace a perfectly good computer might say it. Once enough people start saying that, Microsoft has to compete. And that may be the most important thing Linux is doing right now. It is not destroying Windows. It is breaking the assumption that every PC must use Windows. For decades, the PC experience was almost automatic. You bought a computer, Windows was already installed, and you used it. When Microsoft eventually stopped supporting your hardware, your normal choices were to keep using an old operating system, work around the requirements, or buy a new machine. Linux introduces another choice: keep your hardware and change the operating system. That is powerful because your hardware may still have years of useful life left. A 7-year-old computer may not be ideal for modern everyday gaming, but that doesn't mean it cannot be a great machine for browsing, office work, programming, studying, media, communication, or hundreds of other tasks. Linux lets you decide what the machine is still capable of instead of simply accepting that its useful life has ended. But we also need to be honest about where Windows remains stronger. Windows still has the largest desktop ecosystem. It has broader compatibility with professional software, specialized hardware, peripherals, business applications, and games. If your work depends on a Windows-only application, switching to Linux may not make sense. If your favorite competitive game requires unsupported anti-cheat, Windows may be the better choice. And if you simply prefer Windows, there's nothing wrong with that. This is not about telling everyone to uninstall Windows tomorrow. The real story is that you now have a choice. Maybe Windows is the right operating system for you. Maybe Linux is. Maybe you use Windows for work and Linux for everything else. Maybe you run Linux on an old laptop and Windows on your gaming PC. The important thing is that the decision is becoming yours. And that brings us back to the question we started with. If Linux can keep an old Windows PC alive, why should anyone replace a perfectly working computer simply because Microsoft says it is too old? If you had a 7-year-old PC that still worked perfectly, but Microsoft said it was not officially supported by Windows 11, would you spend hundreds of dollars on a new computer? Or would you install Linux and keep using the machine you already own? And I don't want a simple Linux or Windows answer. Tell me the reason. If you would stay with Windows, what is the one thing you could not give up? Is it gaming, professional software, compatibility, or simply convenience? And if you would move to Linux, what finally convinced you? Is it old hardware support, privacy, gaming, performance, customization, or simply the feeling that you should be able to decide when your own computer is finished? Because that is the bigger question behind this entire story. Who should decide when your computer becomes obsolete? The company that makes your operating system, or the person who actually owns the computer? Linux has not defeated Windows in 2026. Windows is still the giant, and it is going to remain a giant for a very long time. But Linux has done something that may ultimately be more important. It has made the alternative real. It has shown that a computer does not have to follow one operating system forever, that old hardware can still have value, and that gaming hardware can exist outside the traditional Windows model. And once people realize they have another choice, the entire relationship between the user and the operating system changes. Maybe the future of PC computing isn't about Linux replacing Windows. Maybe it is about Windows no longer being the only answer. And if Linux continues improving, if Proton continues expanding game compatibility, if SteamOS continues appearing on more gaming hardware, and if Linux keeps giving older computers another life, then the question we are asking today could become much bigger in the next few years. Not, can Linux replace Windows, but something much simpler. Why do I need Windows at all? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep following the biggest changes happening in Linux, Windows, AI, gaming, and PC technology. The PC world is changing quickly, and the most interesting part is that for the first time in a long time, users have more than one serious direction they can go.